You've recently published an insight on the impact of COVID-19 on food and agribusinesses. And we're here today to discuss that a little bit more and find out some more about the background and the results of that analysis. So, Philip, we'll kick off. Can you please tell us a little bit about the background of this study? Why did you decide to carry it out, and how did you decide? How did you select what companies to focus on?
Well, I suppose the food and agribusiness sector has long been hailed for its defensive characteristics. The thesis has always been that people must eat and drink, and therefore, irrespective of what's going on in the broader economy, the food and agribusiness sector will be afforded a certain degree of protection. But obviously, these weren't normal circumstances, so we wanted to test if the thesis held true. So what we did, we decided to look at the largest food and agribusiness sectors across the world. We've looked across all sectors, be it primary production, processing, food processing, retail, and food service. And we've been tracking these companies since Q1 2020 to see how they've fared through as the pandemic has progressed.
Perfect. Thanks, Philip. And did any of these findings surprise you?
I guess what was surprising more is how surprised the food and agribusiness sector was in its own performance. When we carried out this analysis first in Q1 2020, what we found was that over 70% of companies we looked at had withdrawn guidance. The future was just too murky to predict. However, when we get to Q4 2020, what we find is that 65% of companies have actually managed to increase sales over that process, over that period. I think further, there's been other items which are surprising. One that's caught my attention, for example, is how well some old traditional brands have fared. So these brands owned by companies like, for example, Kraft Heinz or Mondelez have been struggling in the recent past. But once the pandemic set in and people started looking for comfort food, they started returning to brands of their childhood, and so old favorites have experienced a resurgence during the pandemic.
That is very interesting. And just to build on that, Seamus, we know as consumers that our lives and our purchasing habits have changed significantly over the past 12 months with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. What other changes did you see in consumer behaviour?
The last 12 months have seen major changes in the daily lives of consumers across the globe. Purchasing and consumption behaviours have significantly been disrupted, and this has led to a much more dynamic marketplace. At-home consumption has been elevated as consumers adapted to changes in daily routines and work practices, which saw them forced to stay and work at home a lot more. The food service channel has been significantly impacted due to the restrictions on operations and consumer mobility, and this has led to more demand for online and delivery.
Thanks, Seamus. And, apart from this shift in consumer behaviour, what other changes have food and agribusinesses seen over the past 12 months?
They've seen an increase in operating costs as they were forced to spend more money on facility modification, sanitation and restarting production facilities after an outbreak amongst employees. Labour retention costs arising from modifying production schedules and so on. They've also saved some money to a much lesser extent. Selling, general and administrative expenses have declined for companies, and this has largely been due to a reduction in advertising and promotional expenses.
Thanks, Seamus. And Philip, when we look at these changes and we look at the way things have progressed and the shifts that we've seen, do you think that things will revert to the way they were before the pandemic once the pandemic has ended?
I think if in some sectors it's already reversed to normal. I think if you look at some sectors such as flour or home baking, there's a spike in the early days, and that's already largely reversed. Other trends are here to stay for sure. For example, online food shopping. That's experienced a significant uptick during the pandemic, and I think that's a trend that's likely to continue going forward. Similarly, post-pandemic, people are continuing to expect to work somewhat more from home than heretofore. So I think we can expect food service to be impacted by that trend as well. However, looking forward to a post-pandemic world, I think we can see for sure an uptick and a snapback in demand from the food service sector.
Thank you, Philip. So, Seamus, when you look at your analysis, did you see any trends or similarities between companies that have performed well over the past 12 months?
The main trend between all the companies that performed well was that the revenue was primarily derived from retail sales. Another key trend, I suppose, was that the companies performing well were more diversified in terms of products they offered to consumers. If you look at PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, for example, both are synonymous with being global leaders in the beverage industry. However, PepsiCo is much more diverse and they have a lot more products they offer. As well as this, they're an industry leader in snack manufacturing. The increased sales in snacks the company saw led to them making an overall profit for the year, despite the sharp decrease in beverage sales, while Coca-Cola had a very poor year due to a steep decline in away-from-home drink sales.
Thanks, Seamus. And I suppose just building on that, the flip side of it, what commonalities did you see between the companies that didn't do so well?
I suppose similar in many ways to the companies that performed well. The main trend between all the companies that performed poorly was that their main revenue was primarily derived from food service sales. Geography also played a part due to the different approach countries took to the pandemic. The Middle East and North America, for example, had much less restrictions in place throughout the year than most of Europe. And as a result of this, food service sales continue to be more negatively affected in Europe than in other areas, with retail sales higher in Europe for the same reason.
Thanks, Seamus. I think it's fair to say that, it was a really interesting and insightful analysis. And the last question I'd like to leave on is to you, Philip. When you look at what's going on with COVID at the moment, we can see a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine rollout, but it's not over yet. Do you think these companies will see a turnaround in their fortunes this year, or will they continue to struggle?
I think you're right. There is light at the end of the tunnel. I think, though, caution, like everything to do with COVID-19, caution has to be the watchword. I think if you go back to one of our opening points, was that Q1 2020, 70% of companies withdrew guidance. They couldn't see a path forward. I think we're in a very different place now. I think even though when we look at companies who struggled over the period, Q4 was significantly better than Q2 or Q3 for those companies. So I think as we see vaccines rolled out, greater mobility in the population, hopefully a return to food service, I think we can expect to see a significant improvement for those companies who have struggled to recover so far.
Thanks, Philip. So we'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much for joining me, Seamus and Philip.
No problem. Thank you.